I also am completely in agreement with him that Iran cannot have nukes, obviously. The US is actually not funding Ukraine anymore. For more than a year now, not a dime of American taxpayer money has gone to Ukraine. At the same point, he's lifting sanctions for Russia. I think it's quite fair to say that it's an appropriate burden sharing to say that the Europeans, and Germany in particular, pays for Ukraine, and the US and Israel tackle Iran. So the war in Iran has been going on for a month now, and I would say you can roughly divide it into two phases. Phase one, like the first 2 weeks, the US and Israel had the upper hand with their surprise attacks after the negotiations have failed, and they successfully took out the Ayatollah and other high-ranking officials, a vast majority of their military infrastructure, also the infrastructure of the IRGC. And the second half of the ongoing war has been rather costly for the US because of the more and more asymmetrical way that Iran is fighting this, and mostly also because the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and there does not seem to be a way that it can be reopened in any way, shape, or form in it very soon, and that of course affects the trade and the oil prices. So I wanted to use this as an opportunity to play one of the clips from Ben Shapiro's show last week, where he's basically laying out 4 characteristics of a good alliance. And before I'm going to play the clip, I want to say that I actually have been very appreciative of him being a rather lonely voice in taking a stance for further military support in Ukraine, and that he's been one of the very few people in conservative media in the States who has not been blinded by Putin and who didn't forget about the Cold War and who sees Europe much more as an ally than Russia, and that unfortunately is not to be taken for granted anymore. I also am completely in agreement with him that Iran cannot have nukes, obviously. Jihadists should never be in control of nuclear weapons, and that Iran has been an existential threat to Israel in particular, but to the States and Europe as well. That said, I'm going to jump right into the clip and tell you what I think about it.
Fourth and finally, our allies should engage in intelligence sharing and sharing of military capability. This doesn't mean countries give up their own independent capacity, but our best allies should be in the air with us, in the water with us, on the ground with us. Our combined power should be stronger than the power we have alone. That, of course, is the purpose of an alliance. So here is the question. Are our key allies doing this? So far, the only thing we've seen our allies saying is that they are on our side morally. But when it comes time to actually enforce those morals, then they just disappear into the wind. Here's the Vice President of the European Commission, Kaja Kallas.
This is not Europe's war, but Europe's interests are directly at stake.
Okay, so if it's at stake, then why are you guys not doing anything about it? And then, of course, there's German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who freely acknowledges that America's action against Iran is justified, but then says, quote, "We will not participate in ensuring freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz by military means. The war in the Middle East is not a matter for NATO. Therefore, Germany will also not become involved militarily." So what are you good for?
Okay, a couple of things. So first of all, if you leave out Spain, I would say that the moral reasoning that the Europeans have laid out in their most part is a lot closer to Trump's positioning than the isolationist part of the American administration, or at least the MAGA base. So I think you shouldn't undermine that. And I also think that we shouldn't leave out that NATO is actually still a defense alliance. That doesn't mean that you can't intervene together. But Germany's rather skeptical view of the interventions in Libya and Iraq turned out to be correct. So I wouldn't say that just because someone is not immediately hopping on board with American interventionism should be read as a sign that they're not a good ally, because interests don't always overlap, and that goes both ways. And I think the main point is actually that there have been too many things where Trump has made it really, really hard to see why the US is still a good ally in many ways. I'll just mention a few. First of all, support of Ukraine. The US is actually not funding Ukraine anymore. For more than a year now, not a dime of American taxpayer money has gone to Ukraine. All the military aid that's being sent goes through Europe and is paid in full. And of course, there, Germany in particular is paying the biggest parts of that. Trump has already once actually made his threats reality to cut off intelligence to Ukraine in order to try to push Zelensky into a bad deal, just to fulfill his rather crazy promise from the campaign trail to solve this war within 24 hours. And I think where I completely agree with Ben Shapiro is in the assessment that if there has been one side that ever since Trump's second term started, who hasn't been willing to settle any agreement or to even agree to a permanent ceasefire, it has been the one sitting in the Kremlin and not Zelensky. In addition to that, Trump just this year has threatened to even take military force to take Greenland, which is, of course, part of Denmark's territory, which is a member state of NATO, and only backed off when the bond markets didn't go so well anymore. Then he started to throw the Europeans under the bus as far as the mission in Afghanistan to fight the Taliban goes, where especially the Brits actually had a lot of casualties, and he just acted as if NATO is never there for the United States when they need it, which is obviously not true. Then he got his way to have the Europeans agree to 5% defense spending, 3.5 in actual defense spending and 1.5 in related infrastructure. Even after that, he still kept threatening to drop out of NATO when things don't go his way. Then, now 2 weeks into the war, after he clearly said that he doesn't need any help from Europeans because the US and the Israelis are capable of taking the mullahs on themselves, when things go wrong and they don't go the way as planned, then he tries to get the Europeans in. At the same point, he's lifting sanctions for Russia, which is, of course, bringing more and more money into the Russian war machine, as well as the unintended consequence that through the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, the oil prices go up. I mean, it's like more than $100 per barrel. So Putin is immediately affected by that in a positive way. I think it's quite fair to say that it's an appropriate burden sharing to say that the Europeans, and Germany in particular, pays for Ukraine, and the US and Israel tackle Iran. So do I think it was particularly smart of the Europeans to just say no and deny the ask? No, I don't. I think they should have said yes, but they should have sent help to actually take care of the mining of the Strait of Hormuz, because, of course, it is in Europe's vital interest that oil prices go down and free trade can go on. But I think that especially the moral argument is really hard to make these days, because when Merz was in the White House, he actually tried to convince Trump that the Iran-Russia axis should be taken on and that you cannot look at these issues isolated from each other. So here's Merz in the White House just a couple days after this war broke out.
We are on the same page in terms of getting this terrible regime in Tehran away, and we will talk about the day after, what will happen then if they are out. We have to talk about our trade agreement, which I would like to be in place as soon as possible. And we have to talk about Ukraine. There are too many bad guys in this world, actually, and this is an issue we have to talk about because we all want.
I have to say, I'm with my chancellor here. He's laying out a very good argument for why you should tackle Russia and Iran in the same way and in the same intensity and with the same conviction, which is obviously not true for the entirety of this US administration. And I think if we talk about moral alignment between allies, he's laying out quite a good case. And I just want Americans to know that he was being slammed all over the European media for also tweeting out a couple days after the war that it's not the time to preach moral things to our allies about international law, because he actually agrees that the mullahs have no place and have no legitimacy anymore, especially after what happened in January and February, over the last decades in general. So I think especially the point about the moral alignment is very hard from an American standpoint these days, because there have been many, many doubts if there is still a good moral basis and if we actually fight the same adversaries, especially when it comes to Putin and Russia. So I think there's a realistic chance that once the hot war has cooled off, the Europeans will jump in and help clean up the mess at the Strait of Hormuz, so oil prices will go down and free trade is being made possible again. And I hope that in return, they will ask for further assistance in Ukraine and for a stable NATO in general. And I really hope that the Marco Rubio wing of this administration will actually have the upper hand from the J.D. Vance wing, because I think that is in the US's interest and in Europe's interest and in the alliance's interest. So again, I really appreciate Ben Shapiro's take, and I'm with him on foreign policies a lot. Here I think his take was a little one-sided, especially given the rhetoric and the actions of Trump in the last couple of months and years. But I actually think we're not that far apart from each other, and I'd like to hear what you think about this.